Fellas, good to be here once again. Always good to be sitting down and talking with you fellas about dope topics. And today's dope topic is diversity in sports, which is like, let's be honest, it's crazy to say diversity in sports because when you watch basketball, you watch football, I mean 70% of the NFL, at least 7% of the players, might even be more than that, are black diverse players. Same thing with the NBA, it's even more. So like there's obviously certain sports like wrestling that aren't as diverse but have continued to pick up and become more diverse. Now, when we started talking about like what topics are we going to talk about today, and I say why not diversity in sports, what was on my mind was not so much the athletes but the coaches, the front offices, the overarching hierarchy of sports is not very diverse, so that's the hardest part. I mean, Brian Flores now with his lawsuit against the NFL, there's not very many black coaches in the NFL, which, obviously is a big deal. And it's something that people are looking to change. They're looking at changing the Rooney Rule because everybody is looking at more as a box to check instead of something that is truly put in place to make you think outside the box of normal candidates when it comes to, you know, let's not call it nepotism, but, when you get jobs in certain places, it's all about who you know, and a lot of the times less about what you know. The three of us are literally brought together because we know each other, but we also know that each one of us knows what we're talking about. So, like, while I think that the knowing what we know and being as intuitive and intelligent as we are, and I use the word intelligent very loosely because we're, kind of the Three Stooges, but like, let's, call it what it is. We came together because we have a common mind and common thoughts, and we'd like each other. If you didn't like me, or if you didn't like Justin Reed, or if Reed didn't, if Justin didn't like Reed, there's no way that this is happening right now. So relationships definitely rule things more than, what you know. It's definitely more about who you know. But like, when it comes to bringing in the diverse voices in sports, you're seeing more of the ESPN commentators that are talking about things. They're former players. And most of the time when they're former players, they are going to be former black players. Ryan Clark, Booger McFarland, these types of guys, Tony Dungy, these types of guys are now becoming talking heads after being on the field or, as a player or as a coach or whatever else. But the overarching kind of look of the front office isn't changing. When you guys hear about, you look at the NFL and it's like at one point there was one black coach. What types of thoughts for you kind of resonate? Because, obviously of the three of us, I'm the one that grew up with the most diverse background. So I look at that and I'm like, well, I know there's qualified black coaches. I know there's qualified diverse coaches that can do these jobs. Why are they not getting looked at? For you guys, what kind of goes through your mind? And Reed, I want to pose the question to you because within baseball on the MLB level is pretty diverse. College level, probably not as much. So, the diversity in sport angle, I want to pose to you, Reed, as a college athlete. What was it like, and how diverse was the atmosphere that you were in playing at Tech or anywhere else that you played?
Yeah, for sure. So for me, and exactly, you said baseball is fairly diverse, and coming from Texas, we there is a lot of Hispanic influence in a lot of the leagues that I played in and a lot of the teams that I played for, which for me was basically an access to diversity. I mean, I went to a private school, which pay to play, predominantly white. So that was sort of my access to diversity throughout my childhood for the most part. Um, and in college, it I mean, it's sad to say, I want to say we had a pretty diverse team, but if I really sit down and think about it, we were probably 70% white, 30% minority.
Hmm.
And for a baseball team, that's it feels like that's kind of the standard at the college level, at least, and some of the other places. Now, you're absolutely right. I think when you get up to the pros, it certainly expands, and you have a much more diverse pool. I think that's the international intrigue of the sport, but I also think it's because the way the minor leagues are set up in the MLB, it's not an expensive thing to do. These
Hmm.
guys get paid nothing. They just stick them on a bus. They float them around. It is a lifestyle, to be quite honest, that people who went to the private schools and did whatever else can't really handle. They struggle with the 12-hour bus rides to get paid $200 a week to go play sports, and it's just not what they expect, and they get overwhelmed by it because there's a level of, I think, comfortability and pomp that they expect in that environment. So
And it needs some grit
it's
to it.
a little bit, yeah. I mean, to be honest with you, it's almost, yeah, the diversity pool I think expands because the barrier to entry is lowered. As weird and kind of disappointing as that is to admit, that's, I think, a lot of why you have a larger diversity pool in the MLB minor leagues than you do at, say, a college level.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. And like I said, my background in football and wrestling, wrestling's not, it's definitely more diverse than it used to be. Where, last year, half of the NCAA wrestling champions were Black, half of them were. And that was like an incredible feat because it's not something that we're truly used to being in a, predominantly white sport. And you had a lot of people coming out and saying, well, why is this being celebrated? Why is this? Why is that? And it's like, if you can't celebrate diversity within your sport, then you're not truly about the sport growing. And that's like a huge thing to me when I look at wrestling, because, you know, working for Flow Wrestling, it's always, we want to grow the sport. That was the thing when each one of us worked at Flow. And specifically when I'm working at Flow Wrestling, that's like the thing. We want to grow the sport. We want to grow the sport. But then when the fan base sees that, Black Wrestler Association is celebrating the fact that, and not just them, but, the good portion of the community is celebrating the fact that, there are 5 Black wrestlers that won NCAA titles during the same year, and they take a picture together to kind of commemorate that. And you have people saying, well, why is this a thing? The other 5 were white. Should we talk about that as well? And it's like, that happens every year. You don't really make a big deal of the moon coming out at night if if it's not something that doesn't happen all the time. But when you see an eclipse or you see something else, that's a big deal because it's not something that we're used to happening. It's not something that you always see every single night. So celebrating diversity to me means truly celebrating the fact that your sport is growing, because at one point it was dominated by, let's call it one race essentially. And, and that's not a bad thing, but when you start to see these other races, and, Iowa had a racial situation a couple weeks ago with, racial slurs being hurled at a Wisconsin wrestler and his family being called things while they were at Carver Hawkeyes. So like they had to investigate these things and whatever else. Like that's a very big deal. So as you have things being celebrated and strides being taken to diversify these different sports such as wrestling, you also have people that want to kind of pull you back to what it used to be, and hurling racial slurs at a wrestler who's maybe antagonizing a little bit, but not antagonizing to the point where he needs to get ridiculed, his family needs to be ridiculed in that way. So with wrestling, like I said, that's where I came from. My dad was a wrestler. My dad was a wrestler during a very different time. My uncle was a wrestler, and my uncle was a professional boxer. Like, boxing is a sport that used to be a little bit more dominated by minorities, or at least by black boxers during my uncle's time. Now it's way more diverse. And it's just, how do you get these other sports to become more diverse? And it was sad to me to see people questioning why celebrating 5 black NCAA champions is a big deal. It was sad to me for people to kind of push back and say, why is the HBCU wrestling initiative doing what it's doing? Or why is BWA doing what it's doing? Or the things that happened with Austin Gomez from Wisconsin last week or a couple weeks ago in Carver Hawkeye. It's just like, why are these things happening? And then people want to talk about Iowa and their state and call them whatever names, but it's like, you guys aren't helping. You're really not. Like, that's just not how things should be going. If you want to help the situation, then you try and talk to people. You don't hurl slurs and different, ridicule back at them. I understand. And I've been in that situation where I've been called a racial slur during a game. Happened plenty of times with me growing up. But like, as badly as I wanted to beat people up, and as much as I probably did take a swing as a player, I realized as a 34-year-old man, you can't do all that. So, Justin, for you, growing up in Iowa was probably very different than me growing up in Easton. What was the athletic atmosphere like for you growing up in Iowa?
I mean, I grew up in small town Iowa and zero diversity. Like, I joked with y'all before the call, but like, Reed knows this story, but I didn't actually talk to a person of color until I was like, have a conversation until I was 16 years old. And that was like at a summer camp that I went to. So like, it wasn't even in my town. Right. So like, that is the environment. And it's still sort of the reality of small town America. Like, it's become a little more diverse, but unless you're in a town with a community college or a organization that supports diversity and brings more diverse families to the area, like a lot of times in states like Iowa or Nebraska, or pick your very rural, agriculturally farm heavy, diversity has never been necessarily the strong suit or the general appeal for that. So growing up, I played sports all through high school, and there was no diversity. It's me. They all look like me. And really just trying to, I went to the University of Iowa. And that was like my first, sort of foray into like, oh yeah, like different cultures, different thoughts, different viewpoints on the world. But when you live in those, you grow up and you live in those small town environments, like it becomes the culture of that small town becomes who you are as a human being.
Yeah.
And it's, you talk about the Iowa story as far as like the racial slurs, and one of the problems with, it's not a problem, one of the ramifications of living in small towns or growing up in small towns or staying in a certain area for 20-30 years is that you identify with what you love about that place. And it's not necessarily the reality of like the situation you're surrounding with, right? Like you cheering for you performing in a way that in 1985 would have been socially acceptable is not necessarily the case in 2022. And it doesn't give you the right to do it. But change is difficult for anybody, let alone someone who's been doing the same thing for 20 years, 20, 30 years. So it's a different appeal, like as far as small town life. There are positives and negatives, but one of the negatives is you surround yourself with people who are like-minded, because there's only so many people, as opposed to some, living in Austin, Texas, or, Philadelphia or Dallas or New York. There are a lot of cultures, a lot of ideas, a lot of opinions, a lot of stimulants that make you more of a more well-rounded person, as opposed to one sort of nomenclature of this is how my life works in a vacuum.
Yeah, and we've heard from two of the women that I've interviewed, Anna Glenn as well as Brown DuBose, about the atmospheres like that, right? So like Anna said she went off to UCLA, and there were other people that were from her ethnicity, and that felt so great, and it wasn't even something that was on her list. And Brianna,
right, because she didn't know about it, right?
Yes.
Like she lived in South Carolina, correct?
She's from North Carolina. Yeah.
North Carolina. Yeah. So North
Yep.
Carolina, right? So like she was adopted. She lived in this environment and was sort of protected by this environment and her
Mhm.
family. And then she goes to UCLA and she's like, oh, this is a whole world I didn't even know existed.
Yeah.
Like,
Like despite being from China
Yeah.
and coming to the States as a what I think she said 15-month-old or something like that, she was adopted to, white parents. And the people that you are around can only give you that type
Mhm.
of community. They can't give you some other experience that they don't understand. And I think like for her, like she said, when she got to UCLA and it was like, this is what was missing, and she didn't know that it was missing, as opposed to Brianna, who in her interview says she's never been a minority on a basketball team, and she got to Penn and she became a minority on a basketball team, as opposed to where she had transferred from originally.
Mhm.
Right. So like there's two different types of culture shocks that we've already heard about and learned about. But like, and now I want to get back to like what you said, Justin, is like when you got to Iowa, that's when you're around more athletes where they're recruiting the entire country.
Yeah.
What's your culture shock moment when you get onto campus and obviously other people exist in the world? You're not naive to that, but you get on campus and now it's just like, now I'm in a completely different world. How
It's
do
so
I navigate
uncomfortable.
this? And
Yeah. But I think most kids that go to college have the same experience, unless you go to like, your hometown school, or like you have a network of friends that went there. Like for a lot of people, a lot of athletes specifically were like myself, where you go to school and regardless of how close it is to home, nobody.
yeah,
Right. And so you're really just starting over. And from a socially awkward standpoint, you're just like, I don't know how to communicate with people outside of my small circle, a bubble that I had in my small town, right? So it's like, how do I, specifically like that there was start of social media when I went to school. Like now it's probably even worse, but like, how do I communicate, engage, find common ground without being so over the top or intrusive, right? And
and
really trying to build.
how did you figure out that it was a lot easier than you were making it out to be?
It took me like a year. It took me probably, I mean, I had my core classes and my core like club groups that I like would go to, and I played intramural in college, and that helped. But like going out and meeting people and trying to build relationships, like that took me 6 to 12 months to try to figure that out, because you're in a new space, you're now an adult, you gotta figure stuff out. Like you don't have the support system that you went from.
And
And
you're
a lot of
completely
it for me was,
overthinking it, is what I'm getting.
yeah, absolutely. Oh, that's how my life is anyway. But a lot of it ended up just being trial and error of like, get out of your own head and just go talk to people, right?
Yeah,
And
it's
that
not
is
that
like,
hard.
no, it's not that hard, but it's a skill set that is not necessarily innately taught or honed in this day and age. But it still wasn't back when when I went to college, as far as small town America, right? Like you've known everybody, and it's still the case when I go home. You know everybody in the town. You don't have to work at that. You grew up with those people, and then you go from knowing everybody and their story and who their grandma is and what who owns what business, to I don't know any of these people around me, and there's 30,000 kids on campus, right? It's just it's a culture shock that is a fabrical part of the college experience, and one that I think specifically Reed and I have talked about ad nauseum, of like, we really want that for kids because it helps you grow as an individual. It helps you learn new skills. It is part of the college experience. However, it is more difficult for some kids than others based on where they came from, what environments they were around, and just the social skills they do or do not have.
Yeah.
Some kids are just naturally communicative. Some
Yeah.
kids are not, right?
When with us being, obviously sports fans of all different types of sports, looking at front offices, and most of the time you have no idea who's really in the front office. You know Jerry Jones owns the Cowboys because if he could, the logo on the helmets would be a picture of him, because Jerry Jones is Jerry Jones. But like, I obviously know that Arthur Blank owns the Falcons because I am a Falcons fan, but you don't really know all the other owners and you don't really see the front office a lot of times. When you look at your teams and you're like, specifically at this point in time, where you're talking about the lack of diversity in the coaching ranks, when you look at your teams, you say, well, why is that? Like I said, I'm a Falcons fan. They've never had a black head coach ever. They're one of 13 teams in the NFL that have never had a black head coach. So I look at that and I'm like, that's a point that I didn't even know. I'm an absolute diehard fan. It's something that I didn't really, I shouldn't say something I didn't know, something I didn't take notice of until it was just like brought to my attention. But I obviously knew because every single year it was, another white head coach. But like, you don't realize how many teams look that way. So when you hear a stat like there's 13 teams that have never had, a head coach, a black head coach, you start scratching your head a little bit and saying, well, why is that? When, so I pose a question to you guys of why do you think it's like this essentially? And I know that's like $1 million question. It's like the hardest thing ever. And if like anyone could fully figure it out, it would be the NFL front office. Right. And I guess this is, this could be like the last piece of the conversation. What do you think the issue is in these big organizations?
I honestly think it's, as sad as it is to say, it's not surprising to me.
Me neither.
And this is coming from the angle of somebody who grew up in a higher socioeconomic white house in a white community in a big city. Ownership and leadership positions in professional sports traditionally has essentially been a generational thing. You talk about, the Bridgestone family, the Kraft family. It's these huge organizations or these huge companies, these huge families who have generational wealth, who have passed down pieces of these teams or pieces of these organizations. Jerry Jones, for example. I mean, go down the list, right? Like it's any one of those folks. Well, if we really just want to call it what it is, like go back 50 years, go back 60 years, how many races in America were thriving generationally at that time from a monetary standpoint, from an influence standpoint? I mean, when we built this thing, the folks who really only had a chance to get in on the game were primarily white people. It just was what it was. And then when you are in that position and you own a team or you're in a leadership in a team, it tends to stay in the family, for lack of a better term. I mean, whether it be literally or your close confidants who, when you get to a certain place and you're in these little bubbles, it just sort of rotates around the same group of people, right? So you're going to hire your buddy, or you're going to hire your cousin, or you're going to hire so-and-so's in-law, or whatever it might be. And so you've now built up this team of people who all look the same, act the same, think the same. And for you in your little community, we'll use the Falcons, for example, right? And I don't know Arthur Blank, I don't know any of those people, but like you probably want to surround yourself with folks that you have similar values with, similar thoughts on, similar whatever. And that's easy to do when you just look down the street or look down the road and grab somebody that you know.
It's an insulated type of thing.
100%. And so then whenever you have people, and we'll take the head coaching, for example, right? Like you have multiple coaches come in, all of whom I'm sure are extremely qualified. You have, let's say, a Brian Flores come in. He doesn't look like anybody in the room. A lot of those folks probably cannot relate to him on a cultural level, on a personal level, on a mindset level, on a lot of different things like that. And then you get insert white dude here come in, and they, I mean, seriously, like just rotate them through the damn queue. And probably any one of them is going to, at least, I mean, just on the sniff test right off the bat, like they're going to feel more comfortable in that environment. So it's this like we've created this system, right? And it's almost as if we built it before anybody of color had an opportunity to like get any skin in the game.
Well, if you think about it, like, not to be ageist, but like the average age of an NFL owner is 69 years old, right? So like take that and cut it with, they grew up in a certain era where their certain belief system was instilled to them, and they made their wealth and generational wealth either from past generations or during a certain time, right? They have a way of thinking about doing things. This is why the NBA I think, has done a better job than the NFL, partly it was because they have younger ownership and they have multiple owners for a team that have different backgrounds, things of that nature. You know, I think of the Milwaukee Bucks. I think
Yeah,
of,
it's more leadership
yeah,
group type
correct,
than
as
anything.
opposed to the NFL, which is mostly either a single person or a single family, right?
Yeah.
And so you know, I don't want to like, you know, put the Donald Sterling thing out there, right? Because that's not necessarily a great example of,
But it happened.
but it happened, right? And that, but he grew up, you know, his big thing was like, you know, I said these things, you know, XYZ, which were terrible things in the time that they were said.
Yeah.
However, in 1974, you know, were not necessarily something that would catch anybody's eye, right? If you have a group of individuals like ownership that grew up in a certain development and their brain is programmed a certain way, they're going to think a certain way. And that leads to I don't want to say, it's not a negative connotation to Reed's point of, though. It's I'm comfortable with this because I know what this is, right? And the big thing about NFL owners is they want to make as much money as possible and take the least amount of risk possible. And in their mind, what they know is less risky. It's the same thing in a business, right? Entrepreneurial or corporate structure. Like, you take risks to make money, but in order to keep your money, you take less risk, right? And that's essentially what NFL owners are doing in the hiring process in this conversation, is potentially just picking things that they think are safer bets that they have less risk and or more control over, as far as like a narrative standpoint.
Yeah. Well, it's like I said, if we were the ones to figure it out, then we should essentially be in the front office of the NFL. But I don't think that, you know, you guys are wrong. It's truly an insulated type of deal. I mean, even, and I'll flip the script on it, right? My uncle had multiple businesses for a very long time. My dad was essentially his, you know, second in command for the entirety of him having those businesses. And, you know, when you look around, you know, his training partners, when my uncle was fighting, his training partners, his trainers, you know, he trained with Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali's entire camp was black guys. You know what I mean? It wasn't, and obviously that was a different time, but there were only a select few white guys that were really around in their camp at that point. So like, certainly it, as it goes the same way for one side, it definitely goes that way for the other. But when you look at the hierarchy of how the systems were put in place, you say, listen, you have to think outside the box, and you have to be, and if you think that just being insulated with a bunch of yes men that you've been around for your entire life is what is going to get the job done, then you really aren't the businessman you think you are, because businessmen take risks, and that's how they get to where they are. Right. And I'm not saying that it's risky to hire somebody that is outside of your race or whatever else. It's risky to these business owners to hire somebody that doesn't look like them, because then they feel less insulated and they aren't as trustworthy of them. But Brian Flores was doing well. And that's the problem, is you have these coaches that do very well on this next level and they still get canned.
Risk is probably the wrong word that I used. I think the bigger point is willingness to adapt to the environment they currently live in, right? To use your example from your uncle's standpoint, like, he insulated himself with people who he trusted because of the environment that he was in, right? I think if he was doing the same thing now, like, I think he would still have that past experience to weigh on, but having a willingness to adapt and to have a more of a trust or a different viewpoint would be helpful, and he would understand the value of that, right? Where it's showing personal development and personal growth, and being able to know, you know, accept your shortcomings from previous iterations of yourself, accept that this is now a new reality, and really build on, you know, adaptive of ideas, cultures, technology, you know, add your list of things. All of that is good for business and helps generate additional revenue. Now, whether they're willing to do that is a whole other story.
Yeah, I can say, and this will be the last thing before we, you know, to wrap up, is that I feel like, you know, just using my uncle as that example, as a family, we are very extremely diverse. Extreme, like it doesn't really matter what walk of life you come from, business wise, doing business still. So, there's not there, and you're right. A willingness to adapt is certainly what I feel is the hardest thing, and that's where the rigor kind of meets. So, no, like I said, if we were the ones to figure it out, then we should be running the NFL. But I think this was a good conversation, fellas. I think we can wrap it here because the recording is probably going to stop soon. But I
Just
think
be a good human. Just be a good human.
I should have wore that sweatshirt for this episode. Might
Yeah,
be a good human.
Hire good people, and everything else will fall in line.
Certainly.